Hi, everybody. It's very nice to be here. I am going to talk to you about a project called Inspiration Exchange. The way Inspiration Exchange works is that it's a set of story titles on cards that people choose, guessing what the content of the story perhaps is from the title, and then I tell them. And so in keeping with that, I have prepared this talk because I was doing Inspiration Exchange up to about 50 minutes ago. I have a series of cards that are what I'm going to tell you. And the first card is who am I and where am I? You can see. So I am upstairs in the Leeds School of Arts building. This morning I was in the cafe downstairs for 4 hours swapping stories with people. I am Alex Kelly. I'm co-artistic director along with Rachel Walton of Third Angel, a theatre company based in Sheffield, and I'm also a reader here at Leeds Beckett. And I'm going to give you a bit of context about the project, and then I'm going to summarise what I call the story of the day, this morning's story exchanges, and pick out any threads that seem to emerge from that story swapping. And then tell you a little bit about how that speaks to me about the mechanisms we use in swapping stories with audiences and giving them license to participate and inviting them to take part rather than obliging them to take part. And in some ways, this project starts with a much earlier story swapping project that we called Where Have They Hidden All of the Answers?, which was a title we came up with because we knew it wanted to be about asking an audience member questions. And as we finished making it, we realized that that show was actually about urban legends, and we would have an interview with an audience member, and we would try and convince them that we were telling them a true story with photographs and maps, and we would tell them one of 10 urban legends that we had evidence of in a book. And people would then tell us an urban legend back, and we would collect them, or they would sometimes tell us other stories. Whatever story they fancied telling us, we realised was the right thing we wanted to hear. And after we'd done this project a couple of times, we were sitting in the Crucible Theatre bar, waiting to go into a show, and our friend Karen came up to us and she said, "I've been really thinking about the project you did when I saw you. And what I've been thinking about is, why did I tell you the story that I told you?" And what she was curious about is what had, in the story that I had told her, what had prompted her to think of the story that she had then shared with me, because she hadn't thought of it for a long time. And I was really interested in that idea and about how you can facilitate someone to come up with something they haven't thought of for a while, but they are immediately happy to tell it you. And with all of our projects, after they've told it you, still continue to give you permission to use that story. And then, I don't know, 8 years after that happened, that was quite a while ago now, I was invited to give a talk at an event, a Café Scientifique event called Sing to Me Muse, which was about where inspiration comes from. And a group of 4 artists and scientists were asked to talk about where we get our ideas from, you know, no pressure. So we all gave like a 5-minute talk about that. And then we were asked to come up with a workshop exercise that people could drop in and out of as they wanted to. And usually we are invited to come up with a workshop that lasts for 3 hours, and the students or the participants would be definitely there for the full 3 hours. So coming up with something that people could drop in and out of for a theatre maker is a slightly weird request. Like someone else was doing a huge group build with flexible straws, that sort of thing, so people could be there for just 5 minutes or longer. So I came up with a format that I called Inspiration Exchange, where I wrote a collection of story titles on cards, and they were all things that had inspired me and perhaps had inspired our shows in particular. And people could choose a title, and then I would tell them the story behind it. And at this stage, it was very much focused on, this is where we got the idea for that show or that project from. But people told me some really personal stories in return. I only ran it for an hour, and it was I swapped 6 stories in that time. But I liked it as a format, and so we started offering it to other events, and it got longer and longer. And often now I'll do it for a full working day. So I'll do 9 to 5 or 10 till 6, and do a 7 or 8 hour day, as a way of gathering as many stories. And also it means it's not pressured. People often sit in on each other's stories, and conversations evolve. That was back in 2010. And since then, I have a card here called Statistics. And the statistics are that before today, the Inspiration Exchange has run for 62 hours, plus a couple of phone calls for people who missed it and wanted to swap a story by phone. It has involved the telling of, before today, 445 stories. That doesn't quite equate to the even number that an exchange should do, but there you go. It also involved me getting a picture of a stolen Bugatti. The stolen Bugatti featured in a tracker book published in the early 1970s. Tracker books were like choose your own adventure books, but they use picture clues as well as written clues, and they predate choose your own adventure by about 5 years. And I was also taught to dance as part of the Inspiration Exchange, which goes like this. And I would turn round doing that, but I go out of shot and the headphones don't work. So that's everything I had been given before today. So I'm now going to tell you the story of the day. So this is what's happened this morning. I'm going to share my screen just so you can see a bit of context. Of where we were. So here we go. So this is how we were set up this morning. You can see a table with 32 titles on, 28, 7 times 4, 8 times 4, 32 story titles on. I wrote more titles than that and then couldn't fit them all on, and felt guilty about the 4 or 5 cards that didn't get put on. Just so you can see where we were presenting this. This is to the left of that photograph is the Leeds School of Arts Cafe, and we're in a big sort of open foyer that is open to all floors of the building, actually. So you can, I'm being told you can only see the title. I'm right. So I apologise. Let me. Right. Okay. Let's try it now. Okay. Okay, hopefully you can now see pictures of where we are. I'll actually open the chat. So, okay, thank you. Sorry, everyone, technical. It's a bit of an analog project, this. So this was the setup at the start of the day. These are all of the titles. And so all of those are titles of things, stories, ideas, things that have inspired me or have inspired other people who have been through the Inspiration Exchange at some point. The rule is that each time I present the Inspiration Exchange, there is at least one story given to me in one of the other Inspiration Exchanges in the past. So gradually the proportion of my stories is going down and the stories that I've been given is going up. So I arrived this morning at at about 8:30, got into the building and started setting up, and I felt quite privileged. I discovered a secret ritual that happens in this building. Because the foyer is open plan, whenever any member of staff, like the cleaning staff or the woman who runs the cafe or any of the technicians, they say good morning to each other by just shouting into the void, and then whoever else is in the building shouts back to them. And they also try and guess who it is. And I confused things by shouting hello to a few people, and they weren't expecting to hear my voice and weren't sure who I was. So that felt a real treat. At 9:30, I was set up with the table like this, and 3 of my colleagues gathered round, and I got the feeling like they were stood around the buffet, refusing to choose what they were going to eat, because they said, "Oh yeah, we'll definitely come back and swap a story with you later," and then they all disappeared. And as is often the way with the Inspiration Exchange, the first 10-15 minutes were quite quiet, and then the storytelling started. And it was pretty much non-stop from that point onwards. So I swapped 01159506369, previously 01369870212, which is a story about phone boxes and thrill of phoning a telephone box and the risk that a stranger, or the hope that a stranger might pick it up, with Peach Aisling, I hope I'm getting that pronunciation right, which is a story about the joy of holidays and the importance of context, how that if you're in a little cottage on the side of a loch on the west of Scotland, just sitting in the front room looking out the window is a perfectly acceptable thing to do all day, whereas if you were doing that at home, it would feel really unproductive. And so we were interested in that idea that depending on where you are, different things seem acceptable or not. I swapped "they look like umbrellas" for "fair weather fishermen," which is a story about how the teller might be a bit uncomfortable with the concept of fishing. She doesn't mind that her partner does it because actually it's social interaction for him. And we talked about how for many people, in order to feel like social interaction and having a chat with other people is okay and is not pressured, there needs to be an activity that is at the center of those conversations. And the woman who told me, a fair weather fisherman, because her partner only really goes fishing from April to November, it's important that that's his an important bit of social interaction for him. I started to tell the story inside out shirt to Julie, one of the cleaners here, but then she realized that it was 5 to 11, and at 11 o'clock she had to go and let the staff out. I don't actually know what that means. I don't know if the staff get locked somewhere, but she said she would come back to hear the rest of the story, and sadly she didn't have time. In the little pause there, I realised I meant to put play by mail on the table, because as a kid I did a bit of play by mail role-playing games, and I've recently started something similar but over Discord, and it felt like that would be appropriate for this conference, but I didn't put it on the card on the table, so I didn't get to tell that story. I swapped the speed date for the notepad. Speed date is a story about wondering if the person you present yourself as in a speed dating situation is actually who you are. And the notepad is a dating story that is also an accidental coming out story. The teller learned a bit of BSL because they were I'm sorry, I've just got to stand up and walk across the room to make the lights come back on. Although maybe that's enough. Is that enough? I'm gonna stick with that. The teller of the story went on a dating app, arranged a date with someone who was deaf, and so made the effort to learn a bit of BSL before the date, but also took a notepad so they could converse that way. And the datee, the date, was really impressed with this, and by the end of the date was telling them that they loved them, and so that was too much, and so they were off and they didn't have a second date. But the notepad went back home with them, and it was around the house, and their dad found it, and it was through seeing that notepad that their dad realised that they were gay. I swapped veg talk for Are the Veg Talking, which is a story about the power of the zeitgeist and how ideas can creep around and spread through conversation, but also that how science can be perhaps misinterpreted or used to pitch one idea when it's actually discussing another one, but also about the quandary that vegetarians and vegans have when the news is telling us that actually plants feel pain as well, but whether or not that is actually true. I swapped invisible note takers for the invisible note taker, which is a story, I guess, about the power of coincidence, and also similarly about the zeitgeist, about hearing an idea several times in quick succession. I'm sure there is a word for that phenomena where you hear a word or an idea for the first time and then you hear about it another 2 times in quick succession. Perhaps someone listening knows what that word is. But this was the idea of thinking of a really interesting phrase that you want to use in some writing, opening a book, and that sentence is written there in front of you after you think you've been spending time crafting it. I swapped Donald built a swimming pool and Phyllis saw him for Franco was really after my great uncle. Donald built a swimming pool and Phyllis saw him is a bit of a family saga that a grandchild told me, a grown-up grandchild, about a coincidental meeting and love at first sight that meant without which happening she wouldn't be there to tell me. And Franco was really after my great uncle is a similar sprawling family epic that is actually far too long for me to repeat for you here. But the great uncle in question during the Spanish Civil War set up a blood bank for the Republican army, and after that, obviously Franco was not very pleased with them. But there's an amazing scene in this story where, in a village hideout, the villagers get wind that that troops are coming to find anyone they believe to be opposition, and so the great uncle and family get into a car, but they are scared to turn the lights on or the engine so they won't be heard, and so they roll the car in darkness out of the village and down the mountainside. I swapped I'm Going Anyway for Now There Are Two, which is a story partly about the power of the stories families tell between them, stories that get repeated over and over again, but also that how those stories, even though they're about perhaps tense family times and arguments, maybe in this instance, a father getting so infuriated at an argument about whose bag or whose traveling soap dish this single bar of soap was going into, pulled the car over in such a way that everyone could tell that he was furious, and he got out an axe that they carried in their camping vehicle and cut the bar of soap in half with the axe to make it really clear how fed up with the argument he was. And he shouted at the side of the road somewhere in Spain, I believe it was, "Now there are two." I then broke the rules. My friend Oliver came into the exchange, and Oliver was in the exchange 10 years ago, and he told a great family story that I had tried to tell a few times since, and I'd obviously missed a detail and I couldn't get the timing right. So I stopped putting it into the exchange, and I asked him if he could remember what story he had told, and if I could, if he would like to tell it again. So he went first and he told the story Hiccups, which is a story about things not always being what they seem, and when someone who is the scariest person you've ever met threatens you, maybe they're actually doing you a favor by trying to frighten the hiccups out of you. I realized that what I wanted to tell in response to that story was a story called £10 Pom, but I hadn't written it on the table. So I broke my own rules and I wrote a card for £10 Pom and told that story to Oliver. I swapped "You're going the wrong way, I know," for "Play some Buble," which is a story simply about how we can never know about how positive the effects of our actions are going to be, and that all we can do is make an effort to make small changes, to create opportunities, to do the right thing, to do good things. And then sometimes you can discover, perhaps too late, perhaps after someone has passed away, that a thing you did for them, even though you were actually doing it for yourself, but you gave them an opportunity that was actually really, really important to them and of great importance to them before they died. And then officially we were closed, but we did one last story, and I swapped a tin box of curlers, which is about how for women of a certain generation, makeup and hair and the clothes you wear to work was like battle armor to be taken seriously in a society that thought maybe you shouldn't have responsibility. And I swapped that for the cathedral to swimming, which is about the beauty of brutalist architecture and also the relatively well-known now urban legend that people have about swimming pools, where they think they discover that international swimming is no longer happening in their swimming pool, and rather than the real reason, which is because international swimming pools need 8 lanes, originally needed 8 lanes and now need 10, and your local swimming pool can't do that. People believe that the swimming pool can't be used for international competition because when they measured it out, they forgot the thickness of the tiles and that the swimming pool is 2 tiles width, too short. And I enjoyed hearing that story about swimming pool in Leeds because when I was growing up in Walsall in the West Midlands, I believed that about my local swimming pool, Walsall Gala Baths, and have long since then, since discovering it was an urban legend, been fascinated with urban legends and why we are interested in repeating them. And they feel like they're relevant to this discussion, that you give people a story they really want to retell, even though they don't know whether it's true or not. And then at the end of the day, the table looked like this. You can see I didn't keep it quite as neat, and I had to make room for the hiccups card. So I'm going to stop there, and I am going to now just walk across the room to make the lights come back on. Excuse me. As if by magic, I should have positioned my table at the other end of the room, obviously. So the story I didn't get to tell today that I'm going to tell you now, but it was on the table, is called a 6B pencil. And I was, just after I'd made the first inspiration exchange, I was invited to talk about Third Angel's work at the University of Huddersfield. And it was a research conference from lots of different disciplines. So I was there to talk about Third Angel's research into time and distance and time poverty and hurry sickness and things like that. We made quite a few projects about time in the early noughties. And I was on speaking after an architect from the BD BDP, that's the right order, BDP partnership, Andrew Brown, and he was talking about how they had changed their working environments to be more collaborative. And so no one had their own desk or cubicle. They had a room full of workbenches, and each morning people could come in and choose where they wanted to work, and people would move around during the day as the sunlight changed through the windows and stuff. And they found that it was more productive to work that way, and there was more collaboration and more discussion and conversation. And what they wanted to do was bring that ethos into the way they worked with clients. So what they started to do was when they would present their ideas to clients, they would invite them into that workspace where they'd been working. They would sit them up at the long workbenches with their stools, and they made a decision to never show their clients computer-aided drawings. They would put a few big sheets of paper on the table and a big chunky 6B pencil, or 2 maybe, and they would start to explain to the clients how they'd responded to the brief, and they would start to draw a rough version of their plans, because they'd realized that CAD drawings looked finished. They looked like you couldn't adjust them because they were printed out. But a pencil drawing, that can be changed. We know that. So they would draw rough versions of their ideas for the clients, and then they would very deliberately pick up the pencil, and Andrew mimed this in his talk, and they would put it back in the middle of the table. And he said what always happens every single time is the client can't resist, because that's a really nice looking big chunky pencil and there are some big sheets of paper. They would go, well, I was thinking more like this. And they would pick the pencil up and they'd start to draw and adjust the drawing that was there. And they would start talking, and they would talk about the brief differently to the way they'd written it. And they would talk about how they wanted it to feel and why they wanted things a particular way. And this was a great facilitator for conversation. And listening to Andrew talk about this, I had one of those moments where I felt like someone had found the light switch, and I understood my own practice that bit better, because I realized the big chunky pencil and the big sheet of paper is an invitation. You want to take part in that. You don't feel obliged to. And so we've been looking over the years for different mechanisms that invite an audience to participate and interact with us. So in Inspiration Exchange, it's really simple. It's a card like this. There are 30 of them on the table, or sometimes more, sometimes less. But hopefully one of them will intrigue you enough to choose it. In a project we did called Class of 76, which was the sort of the participants in the making process were the 34 children in my infant school class photograph, apart from myself. And we had the photograph as a prompt for our memories to talk to each other as I tracked them down. I found them in a project called the Desire Paths. We have which I talked about last year. We have a huge chalked out map of the town we are in, and we invite people to rename a street. And what we don't specifically ask them, but what often happens, is they want to name a specific street that has significance to them, and they want to tell us why they are choosing that street. So I realized listening to this talk that we always are looking for our equivalent of the 6B pencil. And I do have 2 other cards here, which I'll very briefly say before Chris comes on. So one is Games We Have Known and Loved, which is a project by game designer Hannah Nicklin, who did her version of Inspiration Exchange, which I thought was worth mentioning in this context, because simply the mechanics of Inspiration Exchange were borrowed by Hannah to make a show or a story swapping project purely about games, playing games and interacting games that she did at a games event a few years after we'd first made Inspiration Exchange. And then the last card is interactive storytelling, because that's the theme of this conference. And I was thinking I should really say something about what makes this interactive, because actually once the story has started, people tell me the story they want. Is that interactive? And then I realized today that often often there's more than one person at the table with me, and it becomes a conversation, and people sometimes start casting a story or adding details or asking questions about it and filling in details, and in one case today almost turning it into a movie, the Donald and Phyllis and then the Franco story. Between us, we were adding details and describing what we imagined it looked like from the way the person telling the story was describing it. And I realized that the interaction isn't just the swap, it is the group conversation. That's as much as I prepared to say. So I'm really happy to be asked anything else.
Cool. Thank you, Alex. That is one of the strangest conference talks I think I've ever seen, but I did
yeah, it's one of the strangest conference talks I've seen, and I just did it. I did have a moment, like with half an hour to go, going, why did I say I would do this? Do a conference talk to an online audience that I can't really prepare or I can't rehearse because I don't know what I'm going to get told.
Have you ever done this online or via sort of?
We talked about it early on in the pandemic. We wondered if there was a version of this where I could have like the titles on a wall behind me, perhaps, or people could book a one-to-one and we could show a camera. But there's some, and we didn't decide not to do that. We quite liked that. We'd seen a few things that were performances made online, like Coney's Telephone, which is sort of has a bit of mild interaction and stuff. And I thought, oh, it can work, but we then had the idea of doing a project that involved play by mail, sending people stuff in the post and some video links, and that just took priority. And that was a new thing rather than adapting something that was already made. So we just sort of never got around to it. And then doing it, so this is the first time I've done it in person since before the pandemic. I realized there's something really important to me about this act of, here, you take this card, write a card, and your handwriting goes onto the table, and it can be, I've got that story to then tell for the rest of the day.
Yeah, it was really interesting. You kind of identifying, I think, the prompt, the call to action in a way. I think that was really fascinating. And I had a question about, whether you have any kind of similarities in your ideas and projects, and perhaps you answered that already by saying that that's kind of what you look for in your work. Can I just ask, I mean, when you're doing the inspiration exchange at the table, is there an element, like, because your talk that you did for us was kind of describing the swapping and the stories and the headlines and all that sort of thing. Is part of what you do at the table that?
No, so the table is perhaps I could have been clearer about that. The person chooses the story. So imagine someone had chosen the title, a 6B pencil, like I just told, and I then tell that story in full. And some of those are my stories, but a lot of them are stories that have been told to me. I tell my version of it. I find my resonance in it, and then I say, and so here's the deal. I give them the card. That's like the physical marker. That story's finished. That's yours to keep. And then I say, would you like to tell me a story back? And it's a small little visual detail, but there is a gap in the grid then on the table. There is a hole to fill, if you like. And at the side of the table, there are blank cards and pens, and they tell me whatever story they want. Sometimes it's inspired by what they've just heard. Sometimes they already knew what they wanted to tell me. Sometimes it's something not related, but they've just thought of. They tell the story. I listen and make a few notes, and to make sure I can tell it properly, like any significant markers in it. And then together we come up with a title for it. I ask them to write the title. I prefer it if they do. They write the card, and I invite them to put it into that gap. So it's only a teeny bit of physical business, but it feels like it's it's like moving your own counter on the game. On a board game, you like to, well, if you're like me, I want to move it myself. Thanks. I roll the dice. I want to move. It's about that little bit of ownership. So it is. But sometimes, so some of the stuff I was saying in this talk is like, that's a story about. Occasionally I have to go, okay, it's a really good story. I need to find where the inspiration is in it, and I might say, so what is that story about to you? Or I'll sometimes say, so for me, the inspiration in that story is, and as long as people kind of go, yeah, that's fair enough, then.
Yeah, because the summation you did is actually very entertaining. I mean, even though I didn't really know exactly what those stories were, it was very interesting kind of monologue, or a kind of a sort of headline of where the project is up to, and I imagine you can do that at the end of each one. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and so often I would do that at the table where the inspiration exchange has happened. And so for this, we thought we'd bring it online, and
Brilliant.
That's one of the, I didn't always do that from the beginning. At some point, someone asked me to do it because it worked for the festival. They wanted something that could have a bigger audience, and I said, well, I'll try and retell you all the stories I've been told.
Yeah, it was great. Okay, well, we're going to have to wrap it up soon, but definitely next time you do it, I'm going to come along. I'm really interested in it. But we've got a question for email. It's, I really love the idea of swapping stories for inspiration. What if I am scared that somebody steals my story? What would you say to that fear?
Oh, that's really interesting.
It's a big question, obviously.
Yeah, so I suppose the deal is, and I tell people this before they tell me their story, that if you give me a story, I might retell it. If it gets chosen, I might retell it on that particular day, because it's definitely on the table that day, and then I might choose it to put in the future. I can't put them all in, but definitely one or two from each exchange will go on into the next exchange. So that's sort of the deal. Occasionally, people have said, or after someone's told a really personal story, I will say, are you sure you're happy for me to be able to retell that story? And I mean, that's happened 2 or 3 times maybe, and people have thought about it, and they've always come back and said, yes, that's fine, you can retell it. One person wrote to me afterwards to say she was really glad she wasn't around to hear me retell it. She wouldn't have wanted that, but she was happy for it to be in the exchange. If someone, although that's the rules, and a lot of our projects, we're quite explicit about being governed by the rules. If someone says, actually, now I think about it, I don't want you to share that story, then I would say, that's fine then, well, I've heard it, but we don't have to put it into the exchange. But what I can't guarantee, of course, is that if you tell me a really good story and I tell it, and then someone else takes that story and retells it as something they've heard, I mean, all I can say is to be flattered by that, maybe. That's the way of framing it positively, I guess. But yeah, I suppose the contract in inspiration exchange is, if you don't want anyone else to tell the story, then
don't put it on the table.
Yeah, then don't give it me, or at that point where there is the mechanism to tell but not include, and that's important to us, because sometimes it's only in the telling of a story that you realize how significant it is to you, or perhaps how emotional it is, and then you might think, so that's always important to us, that people have the opportunity to withdraw their consent for you to use their story.
Cool. Brilliant. Well, that was really interesting and entertaining, and thank you. And
thank you very much.
I will definitely turn up to your next inspirational exchange table. So thank you, and we're going to move on to the next speaker. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everybody.